Thanks to the organizers for inviting me here. It's an atheist's pleasure to be here to continue the great tradition of delivering evolution sermons in this chapel. So I will review a number of things which have been touched on by Professor Blackburn here. So pardon the redundancy, I'll try and skim over some of the things that he went through. This is just a list of demographic and genetic factors, which is incomplete, and I'll talk in more detail about some of these things, particularly allele effects and phenotypic plasticity, especially the evolution of plasticity. And I'll also deal with interactions of a few of these things. Mostly drawn from theory that I've worked on, because at my age that's about all I can remember, although that does seem to be a common failing of people, many people throughout their careers. Edge effects are of two types. The usual one that's discussed in the literature are what I would call environmental edge effects, which is decrease of habitat quality near the edge of an ecological boundary. But it's also been known for a long time that there is a demographic edge effect, which has to do with dispersal off of suitable habitat into unsuitable habitat. And this determines a minimum critical size of a patch of suitable habitat that can sustain a population. Allele effects have already been discussed by Professor Blackburn, and there's a number of classical mechanisms for them that were expounded by Ali, who was a behavioral ecologist, and so most of them involve behavior. A modern one that could be added that's somewhat similar is failure to condition or engineer the environment, such as by transmission of microorganisms that condition the medium, for example, in which individuals are living, at least at some stage in their life cycle. Random genetic drift can also contribute to allele effects in several ways, through loss of adaptive genetic variation, inbreeding depression, and something I'll talk about briefly, fixation of new deleterious mutations. And then I'll describe another type of demographic allele effect, which is due to the joint action of demographic and environmental stochasticity. And finally, a metapopulation allele effect that I discovered of working on some models of metapopulations that involves the rescue effect and habitat occupancy. Another thing I want to mention about allele effects is that they can reduce the speed of a wave of advance of range expansion in continuous habitat, and they can also stop range expansion across a partial or leaky barrier of a species that would not otherwise be stopped by such an incomplete barrier. Demographic and environmental stochasticity, it's fairly well known. Both decrease what's called the long-run growth rate, or what might better be called the stochastic intrinsic rate of increase of a population, which is the rate of increase of log population size, or the expected rate of increase starting from a given population size. It's the deterministic value minus decrement from environmental stochasticity that acts in populations of essentially all sizes, and then minus part from demographic stochasticity that's inversely proportional to population size. So this illustrates, if this is on, which it isn't, but anyway, I guess it's not critical.
No.
Here's just a simulated sample path of a density-independent growth, like the formula up above applies well below carrying capacity of a population. And you can see two things. The heavy solid line here, it's weird. It has a strange delay. It's somehow hooked to the projection system. Okay, that's better. So this is the deterministic growth, and this is a log scale. So exponential growth is just a straight line, and you can see even the sample paths that are remaining at a large enough size that demographic stochasticity is negligible importance. In the long run, they're all ending up below the deterministic trajectory. And I discovered by looking at the joint action of these two processes that below a certain population size, which has this simple formula, all the trajectories, they don't go extinct just by stochastic up and down. They actually sort of get driven to extinction below this level. So that's what I call a kind of a demographic Ali effect. Another kind of Ali effect that's very important, I think, in the context of colonizing species is metapopulation level Ali effect. So the classical metapopulation model that most people here would be familiar with is Levin's model that was originally developed for biocontrol, although its main use now is in conservation. But it has constant colonization and extinction rates, and that's what's still used in most of the metapopulation literature. But actually, then the classical result is that the equilibrium occupancy of the patches that are occupied by metapopulation, or that are potentially occupiable, is just 1 minus the extinction rate over the colonization rate. So the extinction rate has to be less than the colonization rate in order for the metapopulation to persist. Although then this also tells you there's always unoccupied habitat in a metapopulation. However, this kind of a classical model ignores all the population dynamics within patches, a serious deficiency. So if you actually make a stochastic model of population dynamics within patches, then you find that because of the rescue effect, local extinction and colonization rates are not constant. That is, a stream of immigrants going into a local population will help to prevent its extinction. That's a rescue effect. But it will also increase the probability of successful colonization because, well, it amounts to increased propagule pressure in the terms that Tim Blackburn was saying. So, I mean, the converse of that, I just gave it another name called the establishment effect. So it helps the population grow up to local carrying capacity. And so here's just a simulation that shows that the colonization rate per patch or per existing colony that has at least once reached its carrying capacity goes up with increasing occupancy of suitable habitat, and the extinction rate goes down. So this is the rescue effect, and this is its converse, the establishment effect. And then these things create together, the fact that they're not constant, create an Ali effect at the metapopulation level, which is that the expected rate of increase, or the intrinsic rate of increase of habitat occupancy, if you like, has this sort of classical form that shows an Ali effect, that it's negative at low occupancies, and then the population growth rate is positive, and you reach a stable equilibrium at some substantially higher occupancy. So there's also a kind of metapopulation Ali effect for territorial species where individuals hold exclusive territories, and if the region is fragmented on the scale of these individual territories. And I guess I won't go into detail on that. as Professor Blackburn already went over in some detail, multiple colonizations are also necessary for establishment, partly because of these Ali effects, various kinds of stochasticity in time as well as in space. And I'll get to that in a moment here when I talk about time lags and spread. And increased propagule size has both demographic and genetic consequences. And this, I think, was first demonstrated actually from analyses many years ago on artificial introductions for biocontrol, especially the contribution of genetic variation to that. Okay, now, people keep saying that there aren't too many ideas and there isn't too much genetics in Elton's book, but having read this a very long time ago, the main idea in there that stuck with me was the following, and that is his explanations for why there's often observed a time lag between the first invasion or successful colonization event and the subsequent expansion of the range to produce what we would call a class of invasive species. And he gave two explanations for this. One is that the initial colonies may be established in suboptimal habitat, and then they have to send out migrants around at whatever rate they can manage to do it until a propagule or sufficient numbers of propagule manage to establish themselves in a good quality habitat that has a high intrinsic rate of increase and therefore leads to a high rate of immigration from which the population can then start expanding out with a high rate of successful propagules and colonization of other areas. And this sort of thing has been documented and studied intensively in hotspots for outbreaks of insect pests, especially for forest trees. And the other explanation that Elton gave is, though this was again just a mention to be fair to the previous speakers, is that there's a time required possibly for adaptive evolution, which we now think of in terms of not just natural selection of the initial variation that's there, but the waiting time for occurrence of new mutations and their fixation by selection or adaptive evolution of the mean phenotype. Now, in addition to adaptive evolution, genetic variation and mutation can produce deleterious effects, especially in small populations. And one thing I discovered quite a while ago is, which I guess wasn't totally obvious a priori, but it's very easy to understand in retrospect, is that for small populations, mildly deleterious mutations, and by that I mean actually nearly neutral mutations, are the most damaging to the population, at least to sexual populations. I mean, I guess almost everybody here would be familiar with the ideas of Muller's ratchet, the fixation of deleterious mutations in asexual populations, but the process is rather different in sexual populations. Mutations with a selective disadvantage of about half or 0.4 of the effective population size, which is right on the border of what Sewell Wright defined as neutral versus selected in terms of the importance of random drift versus selection, are the ones that are sufficiently damaging to have some effect, but that most easily get fixed by random genetic drift. Highly deleterious mutations are very damaging, but they have almost no possibility of getting fixed by drift. And really neutral ones can get fixed very easily, but they don't do anything. So, I mean, this is pretty obvious once you think about it a little bit. And so it's therefore really important to understand the erosion of fitness by this process, fixation of deleterious mutations, to consider the distribution of selection coefficients against these mildly deleterious mutations. And various experiments, well, these are difficult experiments to do, and there's a lot of theory built on a number of assumptions that are used to analyze this data, but it appears as though something like an exponential distribution of mutational effects on fitness is fairly realistic. And so this just shows that the time for the population mean fitness to get eroded down to the point where it can barely sustain itself, and then the next mutation causes it to start declining. And there's some scale factors here, which will be on the order of about 1 to 10, roughly, for most species. This shows how important the coefficient of variation is for decreasing the viability or the mean time to reach this extinction threshold for the population. So this is just if s equals 0.25 as a function of effective population size. This is for no variation, coefficient of variation 0, and this is an exponential distribution. You can see that for populations of moderate size, variability in the distribution of selection coefficients has a huge effect, because it means there's always this class of nearly neutral mutations coming in over a fairly wide range of population sizes. So if you put in something like these are all exponential distributions with different averages, then you see that these lines are much flatter over a range of small to moderate population size than this line with no variability in the selection coefficient. So, I mean, taking account of this sort of range of scale factor, populations of, moderate size on the order of hundreds or even a few thousand effective size are at substantial risk of extinction at least in the moderate term, in terms of hundreds or thousands of years. This thing just went to sleep, I guess.
Sorry.
Now on the positive side, evolutionary rescue. Gummel, Kaiwitz, and Holt made the first model of this, dealing with adaptation of a quantitative character for a population that is trying to reach a new optimum phenotype. And they coupled a simple ecological model like the logistic population growth with a model of selection, where I think it was the intrinsic rate of increase is proportional to the mean fitness due to stabilizing selection toward the new optimum phenotype. Now, this was a while ago, and before people started thinking really intensively in these sort of contexts, again, at least in terms of theory, about plasticity. So they were dealing with a model with no plasticity. And then the next most common, and so I'm starting to talk about plasticity a little bit. So this is really a model of evolutionary rescue by a combination of natural selection and the Baldwin effect, which is just constant plasticity, partially adaptive plasticity. So here you see a case where there is no evolutionary rescue without some degree of plasticity or the Baldwin effect. This line, which is on an exponential scale, doesn't go straight down. So evolution is doing something, but it isn't fast enough to rescue the population. Then with different amounts of plasticity relative to what would be totally perfect plasticity, where the optimum phenotype is always achieved in one generation by developing in the new habitat, then you see that the mean fitness doesn't go through as much of the mean fitness and the population size, as a consequence, doesn't go through as much of a bottleneck. Now, I want to spend a few slides talking about evolution of plasticity, because I consider that to be at least as important as the idea of the Baldwin effect, which actually predates the rediscovery of Mendel. It's been around quite a long time, because obviously even Darwin understood that there are both inherited and environmental effects, and as we know, he sort of ended up, after the first edition of the Origin, giving a little too much credence to inheritance of environmental effects. But the early people were well aware of these things, and evolutionists concentrating mostly on genetics had to kind of rediscover a lot of this. But until pretty recently, it was just the Baldwin effect that was being considered in these contexts, although I guess various empiricists understood that plasticity itself could evolve. And just to set myself up for one of the conclusions, there's been no consistent conclusion in empirical studies looking for whether or not there is increased plasticity in invasive species or in the invasive range versus the native range. Results are all over the place. They vary by species and a number of other things. So the reasons for that have been, or the list of possible reasons has been somewhat unclear or possibly incomplete. So here's a model I made of adaptation to a sudden extreme change of environment like would be experienced by a lot of colonizing species. Or it's now known from paleoecological studies and climate reconstructions that probably most species at some time during their existence experience relatively sudden changes in the average environment, fluctuating around some average value that undergoes a sudden shift every once in a while. So this is actually a very common sort of a process, I think, at least in macroevolutionary terms. Now I want to distinguish the type of plasticity that's been considered in most models and it's what I've just started calling one-shot plasticity, which is the simplest kind of plasticity. An individual during its development senses the environment and then it tries to predict what the environment is going to experience and undergo selection as an adult is. And in that kind of a situation, then if the environment is just fluctuating around some average, the expected plasticity that evolves is essentially determined by the predictability of the environment, and that discounts the perfect plasticity that would evolve to give you the optimal phenotype in one generation. And so what happens in this case is that if you start out with partially adaptive plasticity, which is key to the predictability of what I call background environmental fluctuations, so the average norm of reaction, giving the phenotype as a function of the environment for different genotypes, is partially adaptive, and this just shows a bundle of individual genotypic norms of reaction. So the average environment fluctuates around this mean value and then undergoes a sudden jump here. Then what happens is that the norm of reaction first undergoes a big sudden increase in slope. I think it's because your computer isn't plugged in here. And that's because a small change in slope produces a big change in the phenotype here. So the most plastic phenotypes tend to be much closer to the new optimum phenotype. And then, again, once the new phenotype has been very nearly achieved, the new optimal phenotype, there's slow evolution in the second phase to relax the norm of reaction back to what's determined by the predictability of background environmental fluctuations. And this just shows the time course on two different time scales. A short time scale, so you can see that initially plasticity increases. The phenotype, just with only Darwinian evolution, goes like this. With the Baldwin effect, constant initial plasticity, it takes a jump up and then it's just Darwinian evolution. But if plasticity can continue evolving, the new phenotype and the fitness increases much faster. The phenotype approaches its optimum much faster. And then on a much longer time scale, you can see this interesting effect, which is that the second long phase of the process, and this is a log scale of 2 orders of magnitude longer than this one, the phenotypic plasticity that has undergone this transient increase goes away. I'm out of time. I don't know how to operate this phone. Okay, so And then it's replaced over the same longer or intermediate time scale by genetic evolution. So this process of genetic assimilation, to use Waddington's term, may help to explain some of the inconsistent findings on plasticity of colonizing species, because it depends on when you're looking at the process then as to what you would see, at least in this simple model. This sort of model can be applied to dealing with directional change in the environment as well, and plasticity will increase the rate of environmental change that a population can tolerate without going extinct. Higher plasticity tends to evolve at the edge of a species range because a population is permanently kept away from its optimum by gene flow. And now finally I want to point out that plasticity and its evolution is strongly connected with ideas about environmental tolerance, although these have been almost considered by separate groups of people until very recently. These are really just two different aspects of the kind of relationship that goes into all models of evolution of plasticity. You have to postulate a relationship between fitness as a function of both phenotype and environment. And if you draw a line, and here's just a simple ridge coming up at you, looking from a top view. If you draw lines on the surface, straight lines to keep this simple, and project them downward, that's a normative reaction, giving phenotype as a function of environment for a given genotype. If you project them on this back plane, that's a tolerance curve, giving fitness as a function of the environment. So these two fields, need to be integrated. And I started to try to do this in a paper I published this year on plasticity and labile characters, that is, characters like physiology and behavior that can change in a reversible way. And here I showed that the predictability of the environment has a very different role for this type of plasticity than for one-shot plasticity, and possibly because I assume selection is acting continuously through the life as well as development is acting continuously. And this confirms a few classic things in physiological ecology, which is that the width of the tolerance curve increases with environmental variation. But the one new thing I showed is that the trade-off between the height and the width of tolerance curves, which has been discussed a lot with respect to species extinction risk and global warming and change of geographic range, in fact, is determined by the cost of plasticity. So if there are any questions, they should be addressed to, especially ones I can't answer, to Lauren Riesberg, who will talk about all the things we don't know.
And maybe we can do one quick question while I set up.
Hi, Katrina Lugash. Russ, I'm really interested in your point about looking at plasticities in invaders may depend on the timing. I mean, we know rapid evolution, very rapid evolution is possible in these populations. So can you just say a little bit more about what you mean there, that we may be looking at situations where higher plasticity is kind of a transient state, if you will, between local adaptation?
Yeah, that's exactly right. In this type of model, assuming that